All right, folks, here we are at the end of section 4.1 as we talk about how the Roman Republic ends up expanding and taking over the entire Mediterranean world. So here is a map that shows, if you look in the smaller section, where the Latiums were, where the original sort of territory of Rome was. And then over the progress of the next 75 years, they end up taking over the entire Italian peninsula. They had had the Etruscans to the north, as you can see, those who had defeated the Romans for a while, and then the Romans struck back and had created the Republic. Anybody remember what year that was from section A? It was around 509 BC, right? And so at the same time that they're having these kind of internal struggles, what were the two classes? Do you remember the two classes that had these struggles during this time period? The patricians and the plebeians. And so at the same time that these internal developments are happening, there are other peoples, as you can see on the map, who are expanding. So you have these North Africans who are starting to settle more on Sicily. You had the Greeks, who of course were a great power during this time period, and they had also been expanding. So this is the situation that we find ourselves 2.5 centuries before Christ. And so what leads them to end up being, taking over the Italian peninsula and then eventually taking over the entire Mediterranean world? That's what we're talking about here in the rest of section 1. So first, Rome, the master of Italy. How do they end up conquering their own peninsula? They soon began expanding into southern Italy, threatening the Greek colonies located there. And so the Greeks ask for help from the homeland. And so this man, Pyrrhus, is able to use these giant elephants. You can think of those scenes in The Lord of the Rings, in the third battle, where the third movie, where the southern forces have these elephants that are attacking the forces of Gondor. So that's the reason your book calls them the tanks of ancient warfare. You could also think of chariots as the tanks of ancient warfare as well. But these huge animals were very intimidating and were used by the Greeks and, as we'll see later, the Carthaginians. Now, Pyrrhus is famous for this phrase, a Pyrrhic victory. And so it basically is a term that means when you win something, but the cost of winning it is so great that you might as well have lost. And so whenever you hear that phrase, a Pyrrhic victory, it's referring to this guy Pyrrhus there in the 3rd century BC. So anyway, the Romans eventually defeat the Greeks and are able to take over the entire Italian peninsula. Now, Rome's rulership was generally beneficent. Anybody tell us what that word beneficent means? Well, it means that they didn't rule with an iron fist. Yes, they were powerful, but they granted citizenship to many of these conquered subjects, at least in Italy. Again, as we talked about yesterday, that doesn't necessarily happen in the far-flung reaches of the Roman Empire in the time of the Caesars, but at least it does happen during this time of the Republic. And so that means that these people, even though they're conquered, they are able to participate in the republic. They are granted the right to vote. They are granted the right to hold office. So anyway, this is what happened, and so even though Rome does dominate others, uh, sometimes it's in a way that benefits these others. Here's our friend Pyrrhus, and you can see the Greek helmet looks very much like what Alexander the Great would have worn in the previous century, in the 4th century BC. All right, Rome, the master of the Western Mediterranean. So Rome is going to come into conflict with another great power at the time, and it's going to lead to it conquering the Western Mediterranean. Can you think of some countries today that have a shore on the Mediterranean? Countries in Europe, for instance. What would some of those be? Well, France, right, which back then was called Gaul. Spain, Hispania, and that was back then was called the Iberian Peninsula. And then we can think of countries in North Africa, such as Morocco and Algeria and Libya. So they didn't necessarily have those same names back then, but that's the region that we're talking about. So the conquest of the Italian peninsula brought it into conflict with Carthage, another power in the Western world. And you saw on the map how Carthage had colonies on the island of Sicily. Now, I want you to look at your book at page 76. We can stop the recording here. What were 3 of the resources that Carthage had that led to it becoming a great power? So you can stop and look those up real quick. And then ask yourself right there, what were some of the other lands that Carthage had conquered besides having colonies on Sicily, and the reason why it could be viewed as a threat. So you can stop the tape here. So over this century and a quarter, middle of the 3rd century BC to the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome and Carthage fought each other in 3 wars known as the Punic Wars. First one in the middle of the 3rd century BC and was fought over control of the island of Sicily. Again, this virtually borders Italy, southern Italy, and it's becoming there's these competing interests that they have in terms of their navies and such. So Roman sailors could not match the experience and skill of the Carthaginians, so Rome developed new tactics for fighting at sea. So my question for you is, what was their new tactic? So again, you can pause here and look at this for a couple of minutes. So basically that new tactic was to turn naval warfare almost into land warfare. Does anybody know what Marines do? Okay, Marines are actually a branch of the Navy, but they are soldiers who fight like Army troops, and yet they're transported as part of the Navy. So you can almost think of these, what Rome developed here, as developing the first Marine force where you could engage in hand-to-hand combat, but do it at sea. And so that was the way that they were able to finally defeat Carthage in the First Punic War. The Second Punic War happens toward the end of the 3rd century BC. And again, these wars were not resolved quickly. You might think that's a long time, but if you think about it, you may not realize this, but we've been in Afghanistan for almost 20 years. So basically the same kind of time frame here that some of these wars in the ancient world took place over. The United States has been engaged. In fact, there was a report even this week about the fact that there was conflict in Afghanistan, and so there was some air deployment from the U.S. forces there to try to combat this uprising in southern Afghanistan. So Carthage attacked a Roman ally, and this would have been, again, in Iberia, what we call Spain today, on the Mediterranean coast. And so this erupted in a new conflict. Rome was hoping to respond quickly and to be able to end this war, but that didn't happen because Carthage was able to produce this great leader. The strategy might have worked had it not been for a young Carthaginian commander named Hannibal. Now, historians compare Hannibal to what other great military leader? So why don't you look at that real quick? They compare him, of course, to Alexander the Great, who had those amazing conquests in the East over that 10-year period. Hannibal perhaps didn't extend his territory quite that far, but he was certainly ambitious. Alexander the Great was able to dispatch Persia and Egypt, and in the same way, Hannibal thinks that he can conquer the mighty Roman Republic. So how did Hannibal think that he was going to be able to do this? What does it say at the top of page 77? Well, he wanted to, they say that the best defense is a good offense. Well, you could say Hannibal was the guy who sort of came up with that strategy. The way to deal with this mighty beast was to cut off the head and go straight for the jugular, go straight for the capital. So that's what he plans to do. He marched his army over the rugged, snow-covered Alps and into northern Italy. And you're going to read about this in one of your activities, 4.2, which is going to be due on Friday. And you're also going to do a map about these Punic Wars, and that map may be on your Chapter 4 test, so that's also going to be due on Friday. Were the Romans prepared for his invasion? What does the book tell you? Well, the Romans didn't think anybody, again, geography influencing history. They didn't think there was anybody who could cross this great mountain range in the winter, and so they were caught unprepared. And so Hannibal was able to begin to threaten and go deep into the Roman Republic. During the next 15 years, Hannibal brilliantly led his outnumbered army to many victories in Italy. Right? Some of you who were in the Latin class, we did these several readings through the sections on verbs and passive voice verbs about Hannibal and his great victories. And if you want, you might want to go back and read through some of those. In the spring of 216, again early here, the Romans suffered one of their worst defeats in their long history. This was at Cannae, a small town southeast of Rome. The Roman legions confronted Hannibal's army. And again, this is what one of the readings in the Latin book is about. And you can watch some YouTube videos about this if you want to as well. Now, Hannibal had a unique formation, and what does it say was different about him? There were some similarities, but there was a large difference, and this is part of what led to the defeat of the Romans. So what does it say? Well, the book says that he concentrated forces, and that sort of tempted the Romans, in a sense, to kind of break their formation in their response, and that was part of what led to their downfall. So the surrounded army was almost completely wiped out. In fact, what does it say was the ratio of Roman versus Carthaginian losses? What does it say there in your book? So the ratio was basically about 6,000 to 60,000, 10 to 1, right? So that's an incredibly, and remember, Hannibal is outnumbered, but he's a brilliant general. He's a brilliant imperator, somewhat like Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was always facing a larger Union army, and yet because of his brilliance and the brilliance of his commanders under him, like Stonewall Jackson and Longstreet, and because of the fierce loyalty and devotion of his men, Lee was frequently able to defeat the Union Army. So that's a similar thing that's kind of happening here in the Second Punic War. However, even though he gets right up to the city, he's not able to conquer the city, just as in the east, the city of Byzantium was never able to be conquered. Or think of what we read earlier in chapter 2 about Jerusalem and who was trying to conquer Jerusalem in the 8th century BC. Well, the Assyrians, right? Sennacherib tried to come up to Jerusalem, and yet God turned him back. Now, that was obviously because of divine intervention. That's not necessarily what's going on here. It has to do with the defenses, the physical defenses here of Rome. Hannibal was never able to conquer them. Why was he unsuccessful? What does the book say? Now, eventually, Rome is able to respond to Hannibal after several failed attempts through a guy named Scipio. And just as Hannibal is a brilliant young commander, he's older, of course, now, toward the end of the Second Punic War, but Scipio is able to rise up. And again, he kind of ends up having a similar idea to Hannibal. What was his daring strategy? Well, again, just as Hannibal said, if I'm going to defeat Rome, I can't just, try to fight them out in Spain. I've got to go straight to the source. I've got to go and defeat the capital. That's what Scipio decides to do. He decides, instead of trying to continue to fight Hannibal, I'm going to take the best defense is a good offense. So he takes the battle to Carthage itself in northern Africa. So he crosses over and prepares to attack the homeland. And so Hannibal has to respond. He can't keep pressing the attack. He's got to defend the homeland. So he's forced to go back home. And finally, at the Battle of Zama, and again, I think this was reading number 10 that some of you guys did for a Latin final a couple of years ago. The Battle of Zama, the Romans were able to defeat the Carthaginians. if you remember from the Latin reading, again, just as Hannibal had this formation that led to in the defeat of the Romans at Cannae, Scipio was able to set up his forces in such a way that the elephants went right by them. The elephants passed through them, and so they weren't a threat. And then Scipio was able to send his cavalry against the Carthaginians and ends up routing them. So here's a picture of Hannibal, and this is probably a Roman statue. And again, he's considered one of the greatest warriors and generals of the ancient world, but his time is short. If I remember correctly, I think he, as a result of being defeated, ends up committing suicide around 202, 201 BC. So here we have a map of what Hannibal did. So he takes his forces to the Iberian Peninsula, Hispania, and marches all the way up into Gaul, excuse me, crosses the Alps and takes Rome by surprise. But because of Scipio's invasion of North Africa, he has to return home, and he's eventually defeated there at the Battle of Zama. And again, you're going to have to do an activity with this map, and this will potentially be one of the maps that's on your test. And again, just a reminder, you've gotten the data bank, the test bank for chapter 4, but I did not include the maps because you already have the maps in your book and in the activities that you're going to have to do. So make sure you study those maps, because one of them will be on your test for chapter 4. Then we finally have the Third Punic War. Carthage broke one of the provisions of its treaty. So again, when you defeat a nation, you often require things of them to kind of show that you're still the winner, okay? And sometimes that leads to later conflict. For instance, the way we resolved World War I with the Germans under President Wilson was not very just, and it led to the rise of a guy like Hitler, and 20 years later, the outbreak of World War II. So we did a better job resolving World War II, and that's led to nations like Germany and Japan both being strong allies of ours over the last 75 years. So anyway, 50 years after the Second Punic War, Carthage breaks one, and so Rome responds. So Rome goes back to Carthage, and the Carthaginians are no match, and so they're able to destroy the city. It's often reported that Scipio salted the city of Carthage so that nothing could grow there again. That's more of a rumor or a myth than reality, and that's why you don't find that in your book. But you may hear somebody talk about that. So here is a picture of the ruins at Carthage, and that may be a picture of Sicily. Again, they're not too far apart from each other, but a lot of these ancient cities you can actually still go and visit today. Their ruins or ancient churches or castles in Europe. I had a chance to visit Israel over Christmas break in 05, 06, and visit. So it's one of the neat things about going to Europe and Africa and the Middle East is that you can still see the remnants of this history from 2,200 years ago. Okay, a shorter section finishing up section 1. So after spending all of this time in conflict in the West, and as a result of that, conquering what we now know as Spain and North Africa, then they move to the East. After the Third Punic War, Rome turned its attention to the eastern portion of the Mediterranean. Here, the kingdoms carved out of Alexander the Great's empire, Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt, were engaged in a power struggle of their own. Now, we talked about this in chapter 3. What had happened to the Greek Empire after Alexander died? Do you remember this? We looked at it in Daniel chapter 8, and we looked at it in the historical records. Well, what had happened was Alexander died at a very young age. He was that flying goat that moved so fast that he didn't even touch the ground, and yet he was wiped out. And so the one big horn becomes 4 smaller horns, and eventually that falls out into the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, having these struggles. And again, you can read sort of a symbolic account of this in Daniel chapter 10 and 11, the kings of the north, the kings of the south. But anyway, it opens the door for Rome being able to move in here. And again, this is what the prophet Daniel had laid out in the middle of the 6th century BC about these 4 beasts that would arise out of the sea, about this man in Daniel chapter 2 that has the head of gold and the chest of silver and the thighs of bronze and then the feet of iron and clay. And it is that 4th beast, or that 4th part of the body at the bottom, that symbolizes Rome, and that is basically talking about the last couple of centuries leading up to Christ. And then Daniel says the kingdom of God is going to appear and crush these kingdoms of man. Now again, even though Rome does end up conquering all this territory, they are not doing it in such a way that is completely oppressive. And people were kind of allowed to do as they pleased. They did have to recognize the authority of Rome, and eventually they will have to offer sacrifice to the emperor, and that, of course, is what becomes a major issue of conflict with the Christians, and we'll get to that when we get into section 3. All right, so quick section review here. The man who led the defense of Greek colonies against Roman expansion in southern Italy. So again, get out a piece of paper and work on the answers to these questions, all right? And then we'll come back and review them together. So this guy, we still use his name today when we talk about a Pyrrhic victory that's so exhaustive that it actually ends up leading to defeat, Pyrrhus. Over what island was First Punic War fought? Starts with an S, kind of pizza, right? Sicily, Sicilian pizza. What famed Carthaginian leader invaded Rome by an unexpected march over the Alps into northern Italy? He was, of course, Hannibal. At what battle during the Second Punic War did the Roman general Scipio decisively defeat the Carthaginians, making Rome the master of the Western Mediterranean world? And again, this was in Carthage. It was the Battle of Zama. Better remember what year? 202 BC. Evaluate Roman expansion in light of justice and power. What made the Romans somewhat different from some of the other empires we've looked at in the ancient world? So even though they were successful in bringing other kingdoms, they were lenient, and so there was a sense of justice, and their use of power was generally positive and just. Now, again, we don't want to miss the fact that the Bible still labels Rome as a beast. Okay, so it's still tainted by sin, but it is somewhat different from some of these other places. You think of Sparta and how, or you think of Assyria and Nebuchadnezzar and how wicked and abusive they were of the people that they conquered. In some ways, it's somewhat comparable to Persia, right? Persia conquers the entire ancient Near East, and yet they were able to rule in such a way that they didn't face a lot of rebellion from within. It finally took somebody like Alexander to come along and defeat them. And so Rome is somewhat similar to that. Anyway, here we are at the end of section 1. I need you by tomorrow to get in your activity 4.1, comparing U.S. Republic and Roman Republic. And then by Friday, I need you to get in the activities that relate to this section, which is the reading about Hannibal crossing the Alps and the map of the Punic Wars, the Second Punic War, and all the different places that Hannibal went to. All right. Have a good day. God bless.